Hi, my name is Joshua Houston. I believe most of you now know me as Terry Schoner's potential nephew-in-law. I am also a legislative counsel to Texas Impact, and that makes me your lobbyist, registered lobbyist. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's even more exciting that it's this group in particular. I was at Candler about the time that Jan Love started as our dean, and Jan Love, of course, was UMW's former Secretary General. When she came, she had a rather rock star-like status among many of my friends at Candler, especially the women of Candler. So UMW has a real special place in my heart. And since I'm among such great friends, I must confess to you a deep, dark secret. It's something I've never really admitted publicly before, so this is a little bit hard for me. I'm a fan of Star Trek. It's not something I'm really proud of. You might say that I was, well, kind of in the closet about it. Can I say that? When I was a kid growing up, you made fun of those kids that watch Star Trek. So, you know. Oh, when I was a kid growing up, you made fun of the kids that watch Star Trek. So that's hard for me to admit. But in all seriousness, good science fiction uses metaphor in order to tell a story. It's a story set in the future, but it's tackling social issues that affect our world. And through science fiction, I think the first, like for instance, the first interracial kiss was on Star Trek in 1968. I mean, you could not do that, and they did in 1968, and they got away with it because it was a story about the future that's really about the present. So you might say that science fiction is a sort of a mix between Jesus' parables and the prophetic tradition of our Holy Scriptures. It speaks truth to power about the current state of our world. So in one episode of Star Trek, the Starship Enterprise is sent out into this region of space in order to investigate a missing starship. For those of you who are totally unfamiliar with the show, probably most of you, the way that travel through space works is through warp drive. Warp drive is this amazing technology that totally defines their way of life. It's a lot like cars or airplanes or the internal combustion engine are for us. The crew of the Enterprise finds the missing ship and in the process encounters a brother and sister who are doctors from a nearby planet in this real high-traffic corridor of space. These doctors readily admit that they were the ones that disabled the ship, and they did so, they didn't permanently harm the ship, but they did so in order to get the Federation's attention. They believe that their nearby planet is being destroyed by the high volume of warp travel that passes through this sector. So the Enterprise in this idyllic little world does an investigation. It'd be nice if we lived in that world. They would even investigate these things. But they find that warp drive is indeed damaging the fabric of space and will eventually destroy the planet. And like our cars and our airplanes' importance to our way of life here in the present, there is no easy solution in order to get away from warp travel. They're totally dependent on it. And shifting away from it is going to take many, many years. If we think about all the cars we have just in the U.S. that are on the road burning fossil fuels, and then we begin to think that we're only 5% of the world's population. And then we look at the population size of China, of India, and the rest of the world and begin to consider, what if everyone in the world lived as we lived? It's a really daunting and scary thing for our increasingly shrinking and interconnected planet. And there are no easy solutions. If we were to read the tea leaves, and this is, hit the first slide if you would. If we were to read the tea leaves as to where we're going, we seem to be moving in the direction of electric cars. I was in a rather high-level meeting with a state senator who probably won't name, but he was very interested in this future of cars, where we're going, and how our homes in the next 5 to 10 years, all new homes being built may be equipped for plug-in vehicles. This seems to be the way we're moving. But electric cars are much better. They produce far fewer pollutants than the internal combustion ones we drive today. However, electric cars come with a catch. I mean, everything has a cause and effect. As we transition to electric, then we begin to consume more electricity. And as it stands today, about 34%, which is in red there, of all of our air pollutants come from transportation. But 38%, a bigger number, comes from the electric generation that we use in our homes and our buildings. in a way, our homes and our buildings pollute more than our cars. And that's not, because we have a tailpipe on our house or anything like that. It's because that, what I mean by this is that electric generation is dirty. There's a reason no one wants to live near a power plant. If you could hit the next slide, please. According to ERCOT, which is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, that manages our electric grid and basically keeps the lights on for us. On average, about 42% of our electricity comes, in the state of Texas this is, 42% of our electricity comes from natural gas. About 37% from coal, about 14% from nuclear, and about 7% from other forms, including all renewable sources of electricity. Coal by far is the dirtiest, renewables are the cleanest, and nuclear and natural gas are complicated. Is the best way to sum that up. As to coal, all I'm going to say is that there really isn't such a thing as clean coal. There is just less dirty coal. And even if it was clean, it usually involves tearing down mountains and strip mining to get to it. Nuclear is complicated because what do you do with the radioactive waste? And while renewables such as while renewable technologies such as wind and solar and geothermal are by far the best and the cleanest, it's simply not possible to convert tomorrow. The technology is new, and like any new technology, it's expensive. The price will eventually come down, assuming people buy it. It's sort of like an iPhone or a computer. I mean, when these first came out, they were expensive. People had to buy it in order to create the capital that's needed to build more, to build them better, to build them cheaper. The problem is, unlike this iPhone or a new computer, the customer doesn't really feel like they're receiving anything new with renewables. The iPhone does email, it browses the web, I can play video games, but with electricity, the customer pretty much just wants the lights to come on and the bill to be low. So the growth of renewables really requires this collective shift in values. It has to be slow enough so that the poor are not affected by the shock to their electric bills. And there has to be this transition period and a sustained commitment over the long term to renewables. So for now, the best short-term option seems to be natural gas, which, as I said earlier, is complicated. Currently, there's this strange and tenuous, I won't really call it an alliance, but a relationship, if you will, between the natural gas industry and parts of the environmental community. The environmental community wants renewables, so hear that, first of all. The environmental community is in favor of renewables, so don't hear this as an endorsement of natural gas, but gas is better than coal. So there are many parts of the environmental community that reluctantly favor it instead of new coal power plants as the lesser of two evils over the short run. So one thing on the policy standpoint to watch for this session is Lieutenant Governor is probably going to have some proposals to increase the number of natural gas power plants here in Texas instead of coal. But here's where natural gas gets complicated. It involves opening up new drilling. And as we discussed earlier, that new drilling is in the Barnett Shale area, which is underneath the city of Fort Worth, as well as some other shale basins here in Texas. If I have the next slide is already up and shows you some of the shale basins. There's some new ones in South Texas and East Texas are beginning to be developed. Barnett Shale is the big one right now. And, we've had gas wells in Texas for 100 years. That's not what's new about this. What makes this new and different is the development of a new drilling technique called hydraulic fracking or hydraulic fracturing. They use high pressure, for those who might not know, they use high pressure water, send it down the hole, and use it to fracture the rock. And so when the rock fractures, it allows the gas to escape. And so that's how they're able to now go into these shale regions they couldn't go into before because they're not large deposits, they're scattered deposits. So when they fracture the rock, it becomes a large deposit. And it's new, so scientists are still looking into exactly what effect these techniques may or may not have on groundwater. They may even have an effect on seismology. It could basically cause small earthquakes for all we know. We're not really sure. And what may be even more problematic are the emissions that result from the wellheads themselves. This is especially concerning in a highly populated residential area like in Fort Worth. Since this has started, a whole lot of so-called soccer moms have suddenly been transformed into environmentalists. And they have been getting very involved at a grassroots level as they see these wellheads pop up near school playgrounds where their kids play. So this brings me into the second area, major issue area I'd like to discuss. Apart from renewables, I'd like to discuss the enforcement of environmental laws. The main state agency charged with environmental regulation in Texas is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ. TCEQ has just undergone sunset, which is something that we do in Texas once every 12 years or so. And the purpose, every state agency goes through it, and the purpose of it is to just view the agency in its totality and institute reforms or even see if it's necessary anymore. Texas Impact has been very involved in TCEQ sunset. If you look in your packet, ACT has their recommendations in your packet. So I won't, rather than get into every single issue area and that minutia of every single battle we've been working on during TCEQ sunset, I think I would rather tell y'all a story about one particular battle we've been involved with, because I think it illuminates every single other environmental issue facing the state. We got very heavily involved in trying to change the agency's mission statement. Now, we're not naive. We don't think that if we just change the mission statement that TCEQ will suddenly be a better agency and that they'll have this great come to Jesus moment and the kingdom of God will be at hand. No, we're much more pragmatic than that. I mean, we did this quite strategically. And we did it so that we could have a larger conversation about what the purpose of the agency is. Our proposal was to have the mission statement simply read, "It is the mission of TCEQ to protect the public health and the environment, period." Just leave it at that and bring us in line with what 37 other states already have. We have not been successful in getting this codified into law. The current TCEQ mission statement currently reads, "The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality strives to protect our state's human and natural resources, consistent with sustainable economic development. Our goal is clean air, clean water, and the safe management of waste." Now, some of you already caught it, which means you're smarter than I am, because at first glance, I didn't see it at first glance. I was like, yeah, so what? And then I realized it's more subtle, as things are in politics. In politics, no one says they value money over public health. You have to read between the lines. So, for instance, let's read between the lines together. What exactly does it mean, and I italicize, the italics are my own, what exactly does it mean to strive to protect? Well, my dictionary said the same thing. It means we try really hard. We don't actually, I mean, the mission could just be to protect, but they chose to say strive to protect. So they are telling you, well, we're going to try really hard. Well, okay, but what exactly is a human resource? It sounds rather cold. Why not just a human being or human health? I mean, I'm a human being. I'm not a resource. You know, a resource makes me sound, well, like we heard last night, it makes me sound replaceable. They try really hard to protect you, but you're replaceable. And so my last question is, what does consistent with economic development mean?
As long as you make
well, now I don't think it's an unfair interpretation to say that it means while they try real hard to have clean air and clean water, that goal is subordinate to their higher calling. And that higher calling is economic development. And to support this interpretation, I would like to read a quote from TCEQ's commissioner. He gave testimony before the Senate Committee on Natural Resources just about 4 months ago in August, or 5 months ago, whatever, back in August of this past year. He said, and this is a quote, "Our mission as an agency is where we pursue environmental improvements, but we do so in a way that is conducive to economic development." We have a strong sense of belief that a strong economy is necessary for a strong environment. Now, I say this not to just indiscriminately criticize or to badmouth someone or an agency. I don't think that's productive. That's not how I work. I go into this because I believe there is a set of philosophical beliefs and, dare I say, theological beliefs at work behind the scenes that drive policy decisions in the state. And it's a theology that is very prevalent in both the state and in state government. And it's a theology that I believe needs to be brought out into the light because it's antithetical to the Christian faith. I believe that God's people and God's creation must come first. Protection of human health is not a secondary goal, but the mission itself. Human beings are children of God. They are not a means to an end. They are the end itself. And I just don't believe we live in a world where it's either or. The story we're told is it's either industry or human health, or it's either clean air or costing ratepayers more money. I've just seen too many people around the Capitol in my short career there use divisiveness and this false dichotomy. And they use it to their advantage in the political arena. It's a scare tactic. I'd like to propose an alternative theology more in line with the beloved community, the idea that has brought us here. And I'd like to use the policy area of energy efficiency to illustrate this theology that I'm proposing. For those that might not be familiar with energy efficiency, I'm not just talking about turning off the light switch when you leave the room. It's a good idea, but that's not energy efficiency. That's an example of conservation. And so the more proper analogy to use when discussing energy efficiency is that of putting in an LED or a CFL light bulb that produces the same amount of light, but you get the same result using less energy. It applies to appliances. There's things you can do in your ducts in your home. There's a whole host of measures we can get into if you have questions. But let me go on to say that the world is so interconnected that in addition to saving the customer money, that energy efficiency has down-the-line savings, or what those in the industry that do this for a business like to call a cascade of savings. I like that imagery. Bob Manning works for HEB. HEB, the chain of grocery stores, if you don't have them, most people know who that is. He was in Austin last week, and he was at an event we put on at the Capitol. The goal of this event was to educate legislative staff on energy efficiency. Bob's job is to basically cut HEB's energy costs. He said that if you compare HEB's energy usage in 2000 to what they use today, the energy efficiency measures he's implemented has saved HEB about $22 million a year. A year. And Mr. Butts, as he explained, doesn't just pocket this money. He cuts prices. And that's not out of the goodness of his heart, although he's a good man, I'm not trying to say that, but it's economically necessary for him to compete. That's the business model. The lower prices are, the more groceries they move, the more customers they pull from other stores with higher prices. The more volume they do, the more they make, which allows them to grow. It's basically the same business model that Walmart and other retail stores operate under. And then he looked around the room, and as we might say, he got real for a moment. And he said, I bet most of us in this room are able to shop at Whole Foods and Central Market. But we can't forget about the people that go to HEB stores over in East Austin or other lower to middle income neighborhoods. When the recession hit in 2008, he said he watched firsthand people have to make choices between groceries, gas to get to work, or their utility bill. And from a public policy perspective, this is why energy efficiency is so important. And this is an example of the theology I'm talking about. It's a theology that values each unique human life as part of the beloved community that's irreplaceable. It's a theology that asks, who is my neighbor and how does this affect her? It's basically the theology of the Good Samaritan. When the priest and the Levite passed the injured man on the road to Jericho, they asked the question, if I stop to help this man, what's going to happen to me? Am I going to get hit by robbers? What's going to happen to me? But the Good Samaritan asked a different question. He asked, if I don't stop to help this man, what's going to happen to him? What happens to B if we don't regulate the amount of benzene in the air? What happens to Terry and Carrie and me if we don't watch the amount of mercury that ends up in our water? What happens to that fence-line community if we put up a coal plant instead of a wind farm? What happens to those kids in the playground in Fort Worth if we don't watch what's coming out of those wellheads? This is the kind of theology that we need driving our environmental policy. And it's a theology that recognizes the irreplaceability of each member of our beloved community. Wow. Thank you very much.